She's just a fake veteran. The words hit like shrapnel. My own brother stood in that courtroom, finger pointed at my chest, voice dripping with venom I'd never heard before. Around me, strangers gasped. Reporters scribbled. My mother sat stone-faced beside him, silent. I didn't flinch. My hand moved to the tan folder in my briefcase, the one I'd been holding for 2 years. I walked forward and placed it on the judge's desk. He opened it. His face darkened. No one move. Close the doors now. Military police entered the room, boots heavy against marble floors. And everything my family thought they knew shattered in that single moment. My name is Genevieve Carter. I'm 43 years old. And I spent 20 years serving as an officer in the United States Army. I've survived combat zones where the temperature hit 130 degrees, lost friends whose names I still whisper on sleepless nights, and carried memories that surface in the space between heartbeats. I've held dying soldiers in my arms, written letters to families who would never see their loved ones again, and made decisions that saved lives while costing others. But none of that, absolutely none of it, prepared me for the day my own blood tried to erase me from existence. This story begins with a house, but it's really about so much more. It's about what happens when family becomes the battlefield, when love curdles into greed, and when the people who should protect you become the ones you need protection from. The house sat perched on the cliffs of Monterey Bay, a weathered structure that had withstood decades of Pacific storms. Salt air, crashing waves, the smell of my father's morning coffee still lingering in the kitchen long after he was gone. The wooden floors creaked in familiar places. The windows faced west, capturing sunlight that turned the living room gold every evening. This was the place where my father taught me to read maps, where he told me stories of courage and sacrifice, where I learned what it meant to stand for something. When he passed quietly in his sleep, he left me that house. Not the family business with its quarterly reports and boardroom politics. Not the fortune Douglas had always assumed would be his alone. Just the place where I'd felt most like myself, most at peace. Douglas, my older brother, inherited the company as expected. Carter and Sons Holdings, a string of boutique hotels that bore our family name and represented everything my parents had built. Mason, the youngest, received a trust fund substantial enough to live comfortably without ever working. And I got the house, the memories, the salt-stained windows, and my father's worn armchair that still smelled faintly of his cologne. For a few weeks after the funeral, I thought we might find peace. I imagined quiet holidays, occasional phone calls, the gradual healing that comes with shared grief. I was naive. Then the lawsuit arrived. It came in a thick manila envelope, delivered by a courier who had me sign for it with an efficiency that suggested he delivered bad news for a living. Inside, page after page of legal language that boiled down to one accusation: fraud. Douglas and my mother claimed I had manipulated our father in his final months, that my military service was fabricated, that I had committed stolen valor to gain favor in the will, and that I had defrauded the government by accepting benefits I never earned. The words blurred as I read them. 20 years of service reduced to a lie. My father's love for me, twisted into manipulation. My entire identity, challenged by the people who were supposed to know me best. They demanded the house, the inheritance, a public apology, and my complete silence. The message was clear: give us what we want, or we will destroy you. I sat at my kitchen table for hours that day. The documents spread before me, trying to understand how we had arrived at this moment. When had Douglas's ambition turned into something so dark? When had my mother decided that loyalty to him mattered more than truth? And why, after decades of distance, did they suddenly care so much about a modest house on a cliff? The answer, I would later discover, was simpler and uglier than I'd imagined. Douglas didn't just want more. He wanted everything. And I was in his way. The betrayal wasn't just the lawsuit itself. It was the calculation behind it. The months of planning. The coldness with which they were willing to erase everything I was to get what they wanted. But they made one critical mistake. They underestimated Mason. I wasn't always the daughter they wanted. From the earliest memories I can summon, I was different. Not rebellious in the obvious ways, not loud or defiant, just fundamentally different in a family that valued conformity above almost everything else. Douglas learned early how to echo our parents' ambitions, how to mirror their priorities so perfectly that he became an extension of their will. He was charming at dinner parties, confident in business meetings, the kind of son who made parents beam with pride. He knew instinctively what to say, when to smile, how to position himself as indispensable. Mason was quiet, gentle, the kind of child who disappeared into corners with books and never caused trouble. He was overlooked, not out of malice, but because he never demanded attention. He seemed content to exist in the background, to let Douglas take center stage while he observed from the shadows. And me? I was the restless one, the daughter who asked too many questions, who couldn't pretend to care about things that felt hollow. I tried to fit in. I really did. I attended the charity galas in dresses that pinched, smiled through endless conversations about profit margins and market expansion, and nodded along when my mother explained yet again why family reputation mattered above personal feelings. But I couldn't force myself to love something that felt so empty. Our parents built their entire existence around Carter and Sons Holdings. Every dinner conversation revolved around occupancy rates, client acquisitions, renovation budgets. Every holiday was scheduled around business obligations. Every decision, from where we lived to what schools we attended, was filtered through the question, how does this serve the business? I found my escape in the public library 3 blocks from our house. While Douglas studied hospitality management and Mason did whatever it took to remain invisible, I disappeared into biographies of people who had fought for something greater than quarterly earnings. I read about soldiers, activists, explorers, anyone who had chosen a harder path because it mattered. My father caught me reading one day when I was 10. I was curled up in the window seat with a biography of a woman who had risked everything for freedom. He sat beside me, looked at the cover, and smiled. One day you'll find something worth fighting for, Genevieve. And when you do, don't let anyone talk you out of it. My mother, overhearing from the doorway, looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Confusion, maybe. Disappointment, certainly. As if I were a puzzle with missing pieces she couldn't locate. Douglas thrived in that environment. He became the golden son, always right, always praised, always one step ahead in the game of family approval. He learned to weaponize charm, to use affection as currency. When he wanted something, he knew exactly how to frame it, so our parents believed it was their idea. Mason existed in the gaps. He was there, but not quite present. Acknowledged, but never truly seen. I tried to protect him when I could. I covered for him when he skipped sports practice, forged his signature on permission slips he'd forgotten, distracted our parents when his grades slipped. There was a softness to Mason, a vulnerability that I recognized because it was the part of myself I had to armor over to survive in that house. But despite the fragile bond Mason and I shared, the truth was stark in our family. Love was conditional, and the condition was obedience. When I first mentioned joining the army, I wasn't asking for permission. I was informing them of a decision I'd already made. The reaction was immediate and brutal. My mother wept, not out of fear for my safety, but out of shame that I would choose something so beneath our family's status. Douglas scoffed, called it a phase, predicted I'd be back within months. Mason looked away, as he always did when conflict entered the room. But I left anyway. At 18, with nothing but a duffel bag and my father's words echoing in my mind, I walked out of that house. None of them followed me to the door. War changes you in ways that people who've never experienced it can't fully understand. It's not just the violence, though, that carves its own scars. It's the clarity that comes from living on the edge of everything. It's learning who you are when all the comfortable lies are stripped away. I spent the next 20 years in uniform, serving in places where the heat seared your lungs and the silence before an attack was louder than any explosion. Afghanistan first, then Iraq, then deployments I still can't discuss. I started as a second lieutenant, young and idealistic, convinced that I could make a difference. The army shaped me, hardened me, gave me purpose I'd never found in my family's boardrooms. I became a commander, responsible for soldiers whose lives depended on my decisions. I learned to read terrain, to anticipate threats, to move through hostile territory with the kind of awareness that kept people alive. I learned to sleep 3 hours and function, to eat cold rations and stay alert, to compartmentalize fear so it didn't paralyze me when I needed to act. My first deployment to Afghanistan was both terrifying and liberating. The desert stretched endlessly, a landscape so harsh and beautiful it took my breath away. The weight of body armor became as familiar as my own skin. The sound of helicopters overhead, the crack of gunfire in the distance, the particular tension that lived in your shoulders when you knew insurgents were close. All of it became my new normal. And for the first time in my life, I belonged. I wasn't the daughter who didn't fit the mold. I was Captain Carter, and later Major Carter. I mattered. My opinions were valued. My skills were essential. The people around me trusted me not because of my last name or my family's wealth, but because I had proven myself in ways that couldn't be faked. But the cost was steep, steeper than I could have imagined when I first signed up. I remember every face I couldn't save. Private Chen, 22 years old, who bled out in my arms after an IED tore through our convoy. Sergeant Williams, who made it through 11 months of deployment only to die from a sniper's bullet 2 weeks before we shipped home. Lieutenant Morrison, who stepped on a mine meant for me. His last words a joke about buying me a beer when we got back. I wrote letters to their families, each one a small death of its own. I folded flags and handed them to mothers whose hands shook so badly they could barely hold them. I stood at memorial services in desert heat, saluting empty boots and rifles, watching grown soldiers cry for friends they'd never see again. The blast that left shrapnel embedded in my shoulder happened on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks before I was scheduled to rotate home. We were traveling in a convoy through a valley we'd driven through dozens of times before. The explosion came from the right side, close enough that the heat wave knocked me sideways. I remember the sound, a deep concussive boom that I felt in my chest before I heard it. Then ringing, endless ringing, and the smell of burning fuel. I woke up in a field hospital with nerve damage that would never fully heal and metal fragments too close to vital structures to remove safely. The doctors said I was lucky. Lucky felt like a strange word for waking up in pain that would become a permanent companion. I carried those years inside me, marked by medals I never wore and commendations I kept in a drawer. When I finally came home after 2 decades of service, older and harder and quieter, I didn't expect fanfare. I didn't need parades or gratitude. I just wanted to be seen, to be acknowledged for who I had become. My family didn't see me. They saw an inconvenience. At the first family dinner after my return, Douglas dominated the conversation with stories about hotel renovations and celebrity guests. When I mentioned an experience from my deployment, the table went quiet. My mother changed the subject with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime redirecting uncomfortable conversations. Mason looked at his plate. Douglas smiled politely and asked if anyone wanted more wine. It became a pattern. My service was something they acknowledged in the abstract, but refused to engage with in any meaningful way. To them, my 20 years in uniform weren't a badge of honor. They were 2 decades I'd wasted not contributing to the family business, not building the kind of connections that mattered in their world, not becoming the daughter they'd wanted. I stopped bringing it up. I learned to sit through dinners and nod at appropriate moments, to ask questions about occupancy rates and renovation budgets, to pretend I belonged in a world I'd long since outgrown. When my father died 6 months after my return, I felt unmoored in a way combat had never made me feel. He'd been the one thread connecting me to the family, the one person who had looked at me with something like understanding. Now he was gone, and I was alone in a room full of people who shared my blood but not my values. The funeral was a carefully orchestrated affair. Expensive flowers, catered reception, a line of business associates offering condolences that felt rehearsed. I stood beside Douglas and Mason as they lowered the casket, trying to hold on to the sound of my father's voice in my memory, afraid it would fade if I didn't concentrate hard enough. The reading of the will came 2 weeks later in a lawyer's office that smelled of leather and old paper. The family gathered around a long mahogany table, everyone dressed in somber colors, faces appropriately grave. The lawyer, a man named Peterson who had handled my father's affairs for 30 years, adjusted his glasses and began reading. Douglas inherited Carter and Sons Holdings as expected. The lawyer detailed the transfer of shares, the conditions of succession, the board positions that would need to be filled. Douglas nodded along, his face betraying nothing, though I could see the satisfaction in his eyes. Mason received a trust fund. Peterson explained the terms, the monthly disbursements, the restrictions meant to ensure the money lasted. Mason said nothing, just signed the documents placed in front of him with hands that shook slightly. And then Peterson looked at me. To my daughter Genevieve, I leave the family home in Monterey Bay. The tension in the room was immediate and palpable. Douglas's jaw tightened. My mother's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Mason's eyes widened, darting between us as if trying to calculate the consequences of this revelation. The house wasn't worth millions. In pure financial terms, Douglas had received far more. But the Monterey house was history, legacy, the physical embodiment of our family's roots. It was the place where our father had been happiest, where he'd spent his final years, where memories lived in every corner. Douglas spoke first, his voice carefully controlled. I'm sure Dad didn't fully understand the implications. The house should stay in the family. It is staying in the family, I said quietly. I am family. My mother's voice was ice. You haven't been part of this family for 20 years, Genevieve. You chose the military over us. The accusation hung in the air. I wanted to argue to defend myself, to explain that I'd chosen a life of service while they'd chosen money and status. But what was the point? We'd been having this argument in various forms my entire life. I signed the papers, took my copy of the will, and left. As I walked to my car, I heard Douglas's voice through the half-open door, sharp and angry. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. This wasn't over. Less than a month later, the lawsuit arrived. The moment that thick manila envelope landed in my hands, I knew my life was about to change, but I couldn't have predicted just how brutal the change would be. The accusations were methodical and devastating. The lawsuit claimed that I had manipulated my father during his final months, taking advantage of his declining health to influence the will. It alleged that my military service was fabricated, that I had forged records and stolen valor to create a false narrative of sacrifice and heroism. It suggested I had defrauded the federal government by accepting benefits and honors I hadn't earned. Each claim was more absurd than the last, but they were packaged with enough legal jargon and false documentation to sound credible. Douglas's lawyers had done their homework. They'd created a timeline that twisted innocent moments into evidence of manipulation. They'd doctored photographs to suggest inconsistencies in my uniform and decorations. They'd even manufactured testimony from people who claimed to have known me during my supposed service, stating they'd never seen me in the locations I claimed to have been. It was an impressive house of cards, built with enough detail to fool anyone who didn't look too closely. The lawsuit demanded the house, the inheritance, a formal public apology for stolen valor, and a court order preventing me from ever claiming military service again. It also demanded I pay damages for the emotional distress my deception had caused the family. I read through every page 3 times, each pass making me feel sicker. This wasn't just a property dispute. This was an attempt to erase my identity, to rewrite my entire adult life as a lie. The moment the lawsuit became public, my life collapsed. It started with whispers, the kind that stop abruptly when you enter a room. Then came the headlines, appearing first in local papers, then spreading online: decorated soldier or master fraud, Carter family heiress accused of stolen valor, local woman's military service questioned in a state battle. My photograph appeared everywhere, sometimes in uniform, sometimes in civilian clothes, always with language suggesting deception. Comment sections filled with strangers passing judgment on a life they knew nothing about. Some defended me, many didn't. Most simply enjoyed the spectacle of someone falling from grace. My phone buzzed constantly. Reporters wanting statements. Former acquaintances suddenly interested in my story. Distant relatives weighing in with opinions. I stopped answering after the first day. The coffee shop where I'd grabbed my morning cup for years suddenly felt hostile. The barista who used to chat with me about local news now avoided eye contact, sliding my coffee across the counter without a word. Other customers stared, whispered to their companions, pulled out phones to take photos. I stopped going. Neighbors I'd known for years crossed the street when they saw me coming. The woman who lived 2 houses down, who had brought me soup when I first moved in, now pretended I didn't exist. The couple with the golden retriever who used to stop and chat during evening walks now turned around when they spotted me. I was being erased from my own community, one interaction at a time. The deepest cuts came from people I'd considered friends. Some sent messages expressing support, but with language so careful and distant it was clear they were hedging their bets. Others simply disappeared, their sudden silence louder than any accusation. Invitations dried up. Group chats went quiet when I logged on. People who had claimed to value my friendship vanished the moment that friendship became inconvenient. Even the Veterans Association I belonged to hesitated. The director called me personally, his voice apologetic but firm, requesting I not attend the monthly meetings until the legal matter was resolved. He assured me it wasn't personal, just a precaution to protect the organization's reputation. I understood the calculation, but it didn't make the rejection hurt less. I was alone in a way I'd never experienced, even in combat zones. At least in war, you knew who the enemy was. Meanwhile, Douglas and my mother pressed forward with ruthless efficiency. They weren't just fighting a legal battle. They were waging a campaign to destroy me completely. Douglas hired a public relations firm to manage the narrative. Carefully crafted statements appeared in the media expressing his family's heartbreak at discovering my deception. He painted himself as a concerned brother, trying to protect his late father's legacy from a grasping imposter. He spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions, of wanting to believe in me but being unable to ignore the evidence. My mother gave interviews describing me as troubled, speaking in pained whispers about a daughter who had always struggled with reality, who had never quite fit in, who had apparently fabricated an entire military career to gain sympathy and financial advantage. She cried on camera, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. The picture of maternal anguish. The performance was flawless and devastatingly effective. Anonymous sources began feeding information to tabloids and blogs. Stories appeared detailing my supposed psychological issues, my difficult childhood, my pattern of deception that allegedly stretched back years. None of it was true. But truth mattered less than narrative, and Douglas controlled the narrative completely. Forged documents began to surface. A letter supposedly from a commanding officer I'd never served under, raising questions about my service record. A medical file suggesting I'd never been injured overseas, that the shrapnel in my shoulder was from an unrelated accident. A psychological evaluation, completely fabricated, describing me as delusional and prone to creating elaborate fantasies. I sat with my legal team, a small firm I could barely afford, reviewing each piece of manufactured evidence. My stomach churned as I realized how much work had gone into this. Douglas hadn't just decided to sue me. He'd spent months, maybe years, building an infrastructure of lies designed to bury me so deep I'd never resurface. The worst of it wasn't the public destruction. It was the private manipulation happening within the family itself. Douglas had always been my mother's favorite, but now he weaponized that loyalty with surgical precision. I learned later from Mason that Douglas spent hours with her, carefully feeding her doubts about me, framing my every action as proof of instability or deception. He reminded her of every time I'd disappointed her, every choice I'd made that diverged from family expectations, and used those memories as evidence that I was capable of this level of fraud. He told her I was dangerous, that my military training made me volatile, that my return home was part of a calculated plan to steal what rightfully belonged to the family. And she believed him. Or maybe she chose to believe him because it was easier than confronting the possibility that her golden child was capable of such calculated cruelty. I saw it in her eyes the few times we crossed paths during court proceedings. There was nothing there, no flicker of doubt, no moment of maternal instinct that might have made her question the narrative she'd accepted. She looked through me as if I were already erased, already convicted, already dead to her. That particular heartbreak was its own kind of death. To realize your own mother has chosen to believe the worst about you, not because of evidence, but because it's simpler, because it aligns with the family she wants to maintain. There's no preparing for that pain. It just sits in your chest, heavy and permanent. Through all of this, Mason remained the great unknown variable. He sat through court proceedings in the back row, hands folded, eyes down. He attended family meetings where Douglas outlined strategy, saying nothing. He was present but absent, there but not quite real, like a ghost haunting his own life. I couldn't read him. I didn't know whose side he was on, or if he was on anyone's side at all. Part of me wanted to shake him, to demand he speak, to force him to choose. But another part understood him in a way only a fellow survivor of that family could. Sometimes silence is survival. Sometimes disappearing is the only way to endure. But I underestimated him. We all did. Mason had become an expert at being underestimated. He'd spent his entire life in the shadows, observing, calculating, surviving by being unnoticed. While Douglas performed and I rebelled, Mason developed a different skill. He learned to see things others missed. He learned to move through spaces without leaving traces. He learned to wait. And he was waiting now, watching Douglas's machinery grind toward its goal. Saying nothing, revealing nothing. I didn't know it yet, but Mason was also deciding. Weighing loyalty against conscience, family against truth, survival against moral courage. The decision he would eventually make would change everything. But first, I had to survive the slow destruction Douglas had so carefully orchestrated. I had to endure the isolation, the whispers, the manufactured evidence, the public humiliation. I had to stand in courtrooms and listen to my life being rewritten by lawyers who'd never met me, judged by strangers who'd never worn a uniform, questioned by people who'd never understood what it meant to serve. I had to watch my mother testify against me, her voice steady, her answers rehearsed, describing me as unstable and manipulative, a daughter she barely recognized. I had to see Douglas on the witness stand, so confident, so practiced, telling lie after lie with the kind of conviction that made them sound like truth. And through it all, I had to remain standing. Because that's what soldiers do. We stand when everything tells us to fall. We hold the line when retreat seems like the only rational option. We endure. The night before the final court hearing, I sat alone in the Monterey house, the place at the center of this entire nightmare. I walked through each room, touching walls that held memories, standing in doorways where my father once stood, looking out windows at a view that had been constant even as everything else changed. The house was more than property. It was the last physical connection to the man who had believed in me when no one else did, who had told me to find something worth fighting for and never apologized for it. I sat on the porch as the sun set, watching the sky bleed orange and purple, listening to waves crash against the rocks below. The salt air filled my lungs. The wind carried the familiar scents of wild grass and ocean spray. This place had witnessed my childhood, sheltered my father's final years, and now stood as the battlefield where my identity would either be defended or destroyed. I had made my decision long ago. I would not bend. I would not bargain. No matter what Douglas threw at me, no matter how many lies, no matter how much they twisted my history, I would stand. Even if I stood completely alone. But I wasn't entirely alone. That truth came to me just after midnight when I heard a car in the driveway. I knew the sound of the engine. Mason. I opened the door to find him standing there, drenched in mist from the ocean air, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his face pale in the porch light. We looked at each other for a long moment, neither speaking. Then he exhaled, sharp and shaky. "I can't sleep," he said. I stepped aside. "Come in." He sat in the living room, the same room where we'd built blanket forts as children, where we'd hidden from the chaos of family dinners, where we'd once felt safe together. His eyes drifted across the framed photographs on the mantel, our family in better years frozen in glass and delusion. "I hate him," Mason whispered, barely audible. "I hate what he's done to you. What he's turned Mum into. What he's done to this family." I lowered myself into the armchair opposite him and waited. Mason wasn't here for reassurance. He was here because he'd carried something too heavy for too long, and the weight was finally crushing him. "But she—" He shook his head, unable to finish the sentence. "She's still our mother." "I know," I said quietly. He swallowed hard. "If I say something, if I testify against them, she'll never forgive me." "You know that, right? I'll lose her forever." I didn't reply immediately. I let the silence sit between us, heavy with all the things neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Finally, I said, "Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything. Sometimes it's not about what you lose. It's about what you can live with when it's over." His eyes found mine, filled with something I hadn't seen in him in years. Raw human fear. The kind that comes from standing at a crossroads where every path leads to pain. "I don't want to lose you too," he said softly, his voice breaking. I felt my chest tighten. After everything, after the betrayal and the distance and the years of silence, those words still pierced deeper than any courtroom testimony ever could. "You won't lose me," I said quietly. "Not if you choose the truth. But Mason..." I paused, needing him to understand this completely. "I can't make this decision for you. Whatever you choose, I'll understand. I won't hate you if you stay silent. I won't blame you for protecting yourself. But you have to be able to live with whichever choice you make." For a long moment, Mason didn't move. He sat there in my father's house, in the room where we'd both learned what family was supposed to mean, wrestling with a decision that would define who he was for the rest of his life. Then slowly he nodded. "I'll speak," he whispered. "Tomorrow. I'll tell them everything." I exhaled, not relief exactly, not victory, just the release of tension I'd been holding for months. The knowledge that the choice wasn't mine to force, but his to make. And he had made it. We sat together in the darkness for hours after that, not saying much, just existing in the same space the way we had as children, when the world felt too big and frightening. When he finally left just before dawn, he paused at the door. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For never giving up on me, even when I gave you every reason to." I watched him drive away, taillights disappearing into the pre-dawn mist, and allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, we might survive this after all. The courtroom the following morning felt different from every session before. The air still carried the same tension, the faces still wore the same wary expressions. But something fundamental had shifted. I could feel it the moment I walked in. Douglas looked restless, his usual composure fractured. His pen tapped against the table in an irregular rhythm. His eyes darted around the room, landing nowhere. My mother sat rigid beside him, her expression carved from ice. But I noticed her hands trembling slightly in her lap. "And Mason." Mason sat in the gallery, not in his usual spot at the edge, but closer to the front. His hands were clasped together, knuckles white, but his head was up. He was no longer hiding. The judge called the session to order. My attorney stood first, presenting closing arguments with calm precision. She methodically dismantled Douglas's claims piece by piece, presenting authenticated service records, verified deployment documentation, commendations signed by generals whose credentials were beyond question. Then she said the words that changed the tenor of the entire room. "Your Honor, the defense has repeatedly questioned my client's integrity, her service, her very identity. Today, we present definitive evidence not only refuting those claims, but exposing an extensive pattern of fraud perpetrated by the plaintiffs themselves." She nodded toward me. I stood, the tan folder in my hands feeling heavier than any weapon I'd ever carried. My footsteps echoed as I crossed to the bench. I could feel every eye in the room following my movement. I placed the folder on the judge's desk. Everything after that moved in surreal slow motion. The judge adjusted his glasses and opened the folder. He flipped the first page, then the second. His brow furrowed. His eyes darkened with something that looked like anger or maybe disgust. The silence stretched so long I could hear my own heartbeat. Then, in a voice low but sharp enough to cut through the tension, he spoke. "No one move. Bailiff, close the doors now." The courtroom gasped. Chairs scraped against the floor. People twisted in their seats trying to understand what was happening. Before anyone could fully process the words, the side doors opened. 2 uniformed military police officers entered, their faces expressionless, their movements crisp and controlled. They weren't here for show. They were here on orders. The judge looked up, his voice rising just enough to carry through the stunned room. "This court is now in immediate possession of evidence suggesting criminal fraud involving federal military benefits, forged legal documents, and obstruction of justice." Douglas's face drained of color in an instant. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His lawyer, who just moments before had been organizing papers for his closing argument, dropped every sheet he was holding. They scattered across the floor like leaves in wind. My mother sat frozen, her eyes wide, her lips trembling but silent. She looked not at me, not at Douglas, but at the judge, as though the gravity of what was unfolding had finally begun to penetrate her carefully constructed denial. The military police moved methodically. One approached the bench to receive instructions from the judge. The other positioned himself near the doors, ensuring no one left. The bailiff moved quickly to secure the courtroom, his earlier casual demeanor replaced by urgent professionalism. I returned to my seat, keeping my eyes forward, hands resting calmly in my lap. Inside, my heart raced, but outwardly I remained still. I had delivered the truth. Now the truth would speak for itself. The judge called for a brief recess to allow for preliminary review of the evidence. Court officers moved with swift efficiency. Douglas tried to rise, perhaps to speak to his attorney, perhaps to flee, but one of the military police officers gestured for him to remain seated. The movement was subtle but unmistakably an order. I watched the panic spread across Douglas's face. The smooth confidence he'd worn like armor for so long was cracking, revealing something desperate underneath. His eyes darted around the room, searching for escape routes, for explanations, for any way to regain control of a situation spiraling beyond his reach. My mother's mask finally slipped. Her hands shook visibly now. Her breathing had become shallow, rapid. She turned to Douglas, and for the first time, I saw something like doubt in her eyes. As if she were finally asking herself the question she'd avoided for months. What if I've been wrong? Mason sat perfectly still, his face pale but his gaze steady. Our eyes met across the courtroom for the briefest moment. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The decision he had made, the evidence he'd helped me gather, was speaking now in ways words never could. When the judge returned 20 minutes later, his expression was grave. He confirmed that the evidence warranted immediate investigation at the federal level. The civil case would be suspended pending criminal inquiries. He ordered the military police to remain present and instructed both Douglas and my mother not to leave the jurisdiction. Douglas slumped in his seat, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. My mother's head dropped, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The gull struck once. The hearing was adjourned. I stood slowly, exhaling for the first time in what felt like hours. My attorney touched my shoulder briefly, a gesture of solidarity. Mason made his way through the crowd toward me, his steps hesitant but determined. The war wasn't completely over. Criminal proceedings would take months. Investigations would stretch on. Testimonies would be required. But the battle where my identity and my truth had been on trial, was won. I walked out of that courthouse into afternoon sunlight that felt almost painfully bright. Reporters shouted questions I didn't answer. Cameras clicked. Strangers stared. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something I'd almost forgotten. Peace. Not because I had won, not because I had destroyed my enemies, but because I had stood my ground and the truth, finally, had been allowed to speak. The folder I'd handed to the judge contained 2 years of work. 2 years of Mason quietly documenting, investigating and compiling evidence while pretending to remain neutral. 2 years of financial records, forensic analysis, authenticated documents, and digital trails that told a story Douglas and my mother had worked so hard to bury. The truth revealed itself in layers, each more damning than the last. The first section contained financial records showing funds supposedly earmarked for veterans' charities. Douglas had established 3 non-profit organizations over the past 5 years, all claiming to support wounded veterans and military families. He'd used my name, my image, even fabricated quotes attributed to me endorsing these charities. Press releases showed me as the public face of these organizations, though I'd never heard of them until Mason brought them to my attention. The money donated to these charities, hundreds of thousands of dollars from well-meaning supporters, never reached a single veteran. Instead, it was funneled through a complex network of shell companies into private accounts controlled by Douglas and my mother. The paper trail was intricate, designed to be difficult to follow, but Mason had followed it meticulously. Bank statements, transfer records, incorporation documents, all of it painted a clear picture of systematic fraud. They had exploited my military service, the very core of my identity, and turned it into a profit center built on lies. The second section contained the forensic analysis of my father's will. The version presented in court showed amendments made mere weeks before his death, changes that subtly shifted more control and assets to Douglas. These amendments bore my father's signature, but the forensic analysis revealed that signature was forged. The ink was wrong, applied with a modern pen rather than the fountain pen my father had used for legal documents his entire life. The pressure patterns didn't match authentic samples. Most damning, the paper itself was manufactured in a batch produced 6 months after my father's death. The amendments had been created posthumously by an attorney on Douglas's payroll, carefully inserted into the legal record to appear legitimate. My father's actual will, the original document, had been simple and clear. The Monterey house to me, the business to Douglas, the trust to Mason. No complications, no amendments, no posthumous changes. Douglas had literally tried to rewrite our father's final wishes to suit his own ambitions. The third section contained the emails. This was Mason's most dangerous contribution. Evidence he'd gathered by accessing Douglas's computer during a family dinner months before the lawsuit was filed. Chains of correspondence between Douglas and my mother, spanning more than a year, discussing their plan in explicit detail. They spoke casually about how to contest the will, how to discredit my service, how to manufacture doubt about my mental stability. They debated whether to pursue criminal charges of stolen valor or settle for civil claims. They discussed hiring investigators to dig up anything from my past that could be weaponized against me. In one email, Douglas wrote, "No one will believe her. She's been gone for 20 years. We control the narrative here." My mother's response, "What about Mason?" Douglas Mason won't risk choosing her over us. He never has before. Reading those words had been like swallowing glass. The calculation, the coldness, the absolute certainty that they could erase me with impunity because I was alone, and they held all the power. But they miscalculated Mason. They saw his silence as complicity when it was actually documentation. The fourth section contained testimony from people who could verify my service. Former commanding officers, soldiers I'd served with, military administrators who could authenticate every claim Douglas had tried to discredit. Their statements were notarized, detailed, and unimpeachable. One came from a general I'd served under in Afghanistan. He wrote, "Major Carter was one of the finest officers I've had the privilege to serve alongside. Her leadership saved countless lives, including my own during an ambush in Kandahar province. Any suggestion that her service is fabricated is not only false, but insulting to every soldier who served with her." Another came from a soldier I'd pulled from a burning vehicle after an IED strike. He wrote simply, "Genevieve Carter is the reason I'm alive to write this. She's the reason my daughter knows her father. Anyone questioning her service can answer to me." There were a dozen more, each one a testament to years of service, sacrifice, and honor that Douglas had tried to erase with fabricated documents and manufactured doubt. The final section contained evidence of the forged documents Douglas's legal team had presented. Mason had tracked down the actual creators, low-level employees at a document production company Douglas had hired through intermediaries. They'd been paid to create medical files, psychological evaluations, and military correspondence that appeared authentic but was entirely fabricated. One of these employees, guilt-ridden after seeing the media coverage, had come forward to Mason with copies of everything they'd been asked to produce, including email instructions from Douglas's legal team detailing exactly what the documents should say. It was a complete, devastating picture of fraud, conspiracy, and calculated cruelty. When the judge finished reviewing the evidence, he didn't just dismiss the civil case. He referred the entire matter to federal prosecutors for criminal investigation. Within weeks, Douglas and my mother were formally charged with fraud, conspiracy, forgery, and misuse of charitable funds. The trial that followed played out over 6 months. I attended every day, sitting in the gallery, watching as prosecutors methodically presented the evidence Mason and I had compiled. Douglas's lawyers tried various defense strategies, none of them successful. How could they defend against documentation so thorough, so damning? Mason testified for 3 days. His voice was quiet but steady as he walked the jury through his discovery of the emails, his decision to investigate further, his months of secretly documenting his brother's crimes. He admitted his fear, his shame at staying silent for so long, his guilt over not acting sooner. When Douglas's lawyer tried to paint him as a traitor to his family, Mason looked directly at his brother and said, "Family is supposed to protect each other, not destroy each other. I protected the only member of my family who ever protected me." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Douglas was found guilty on all counts. He received 7 years in federal prison for fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement of charitable funds. The judge added 2 additional years for the forged will, calling it a violation of trust that strikes at the heart of family and legal integrity. My mother was found guilty of conspiracy and fraud. Given her age and lesser role in the scheme's execution, she received 3 years, with the possibility of serving the last year under house arrest. Carter and Sons Holdings was dissolved as part of the restitution. Assets were liquidated, with proceeds going first to repay the defrauded charitable donors, then to cover legal fees and damages. What remained was split between creditors and a settlement fund for the charities that should have received the money in the first place. The empire my parents had spent their lives building vanished in the space of a court order. Through all of this, Mason struggled with guilt so profound it physically changed him. He lost weight, developed insomnia, started seeing a therapist twice a week. He moved out of the family home the day after the verdict, unable to remain in spaces so full of memories. We met for coffee regularly during those months. Not often, but consistently. Sometimes we talked about the trial, about the evidence, about the strange relief that comes from truth being acknowledged publicly. Other times we talked about nothing consequential, books he was reading, places he wanted to visit, small observations about the world that felt precious precisely because they were ordinary. He apologized constantly in those early months for not acting sooner, for staying silent so long, for letting me face Douglas's attacks alone initially. I told him repeatedly that he had nothing to apologize for, that his choice to come forward had saved me, that his courage had come exactly when it needed to. But guilt doesn't respond to logic. It sits in your chest and feeds on every moment you wish you could redo. Slowly over months, Mason began to heal. He started writing, journaling at first, then attempting short stories. Eventually a memoir about growing up in a family where love was currency and loyalty was weaponized. He found a therapist who specialized in family trauma and began unpacking decades of conditioning that had taught him silence was survival. A year after the trial concluded, Mason moved to a small coastal town in Oregon. He bought a building on Main Street and opened a bookstore, the kind with worn wooden floors and comfortable chairs and cats sleeping in sunny window displays. He sent me pictures of the space as he renovated it, pride evident in every caption. I visited for the grand opening. The store was beautiful, filled with carefully curated selections and a reading nook that reminded me of the library corners where we'd both hidden as children. Mason seemed lighter there, unburdened by family history, free to become whoever he wanted to be. "I'm starting over," he told me that day, as we sat drinking coffee and watching customers browse his shelves. No more being the quiet one who hides, no more choosing silence because it's easier than speaking. I squeezed his hand. "I'm proud of you." He smiled, a real smile, the kind I hadn't seen on his face in decades. I learned from the best. As for me, the Monterey house became my sanctuary in the truest sense. I spent months restoring it, not just repairing damage, but reclaiming it as mine. I tore up old carpet to reveal hardwood floors my father had installed. I repainted rooms in colors that made me happy rather than colors that matched family expectations. I planted a garden, roses and lavender and wild coastal plants that thrived in salt air and wind. I started volunteering at a veterans outreach center 2 towns over. Not in any official capacity, just showing up to talk to soldiers struggling with reintegration, with trauma, with the gap between military life and civilian existence that feels impossible to bridge. I didn't offer advice. I just listened, and occasionally shared my own experiences when it seemed helpful. Some days were harder than others. I still woke from nightmares, still felt the phantom ache in my shoulder where shrapnel remained, still found myself scanning environments for threats that didn't exist in suburban California. But the nightmares grew less frequent. The hypervigilance softened. The weight in my chest lightened incrementally. I learned to sleep past dawn. I learned to sit with coffee and watch the ocean without needing a purpose for the watching. I learned that peace isn't something you find fully formed. It's something you build, one choice at a time, one quiet morning at a time, one moment of choosing yourself over the expectations of people who never truly saw you. The media attention faded as new scandals emerged to capture public interest. My name stopped appearing in headlines. The online comment sections moved on to other targets. The reporters stopped calling. Some veterans organizations reached out to apologize for their earlier distance, offering to honor my service publicly as a form of restitution. I declined politely. I didn't need public validation anymore. I'd learned the hard way that external recognition, while nice, couldn't provide what I really needed, which was internal peace with who I was and what I'd survived. I wrote occasionally, not for publication but for myself. Stories about deployment, memories of soldiers I'd served with, reflections on what service had taught me. Writing became a way of processing, of holding on to truths I didn't want to lose even as I worked to release the pains surrounding them. 2 years after the trial, I received a letter from my mother. It came from the residential facility where she was serving the final year of her sentence under modified house arrest. The handwriting was shakier than I remembered, the paper thin and institutional. The letter was short. She didn't apologize, not exactly. She didn't ask for forgiveness or claim she'd been manipulated by Douglas. Instead, she wrote about regret, about looking back at choices she'd made and seeing clearly for the first time how wrong she'd been. She wrote about lying awake at night thinking about the daughter she'd failed to protect, to believe in, to love unconditionally. She ended with, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect anything. I just wanted you to know that I see now what I refused to see then. You were telling the truth. You always were. And I chose not to believe you. That's something I'll carry for whatever time I have left. I read the letter 3 times, sitting on the porch of the house she'd tried to take from me, looking out at the ocean my father had loved. I felt sadness, but not the sharp, cutting pain I might have expected. Just a quiet acknowledgement of loss, of years that couldn't be reclaimed, of a relationship that had died long before the trial made it official. I never responded to the letter, not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing left to say. Some bridges once burned can't be rebuilt. Some relationships end not with drama, but with quiet acceptance of their impossibility. What I did do was forgive her. Not for her sake, but for mine. Because carrying hate is exhausting, and I'd spent too many years carrying weights that weren't mine to bear. Forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation. It didn't mean pretending the harm hadn't happened. It just meant releasing the hope that the past could have been different, and accepting that this was the family I got. These were the wounds I carried, and I could still build a life worth living despite all of it. 3 years after the trial, on a morning that felt like any other, I woke to sunlight streaming through my bedroom window and realized something had shifted. The tightness in my chest that had been my constant companion for years was gone. Not diminished, not manageable, but actually gone. I got up, made coffee, sat on the porch in my father's old chair, and watched the waves roll in. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt simply content. Not happy in the explosive, temporary way of big victories or surprising joys, but content in the deep, sustaining way that comes from being at peace with who you are and the life you've built. I thought about the woman who had walked into that courtroom 3 years earlier, carrying a folder full of truth and a chest full of fear. I thought about the soldier who had come home expecting nothing and found betrayal instead. I thought about the daughter who had spent her childhood feeling like she didn't belong, and her adulthood proving she belonged to something larger than family approval. And I realized all of those women were me, but they weren't the complete story. The complete story included this morning, this coffee, this view, this hard-won peace. I learned something crucial through all of it. You don't overcome trauma by erasing it, or pretending it didn't shape you. You overcome it by integrating it, by letting it teach you without letting it define you, by building a life so full of meaning that the wounds become just one part of a much larger story. I am Genevieve Carter. I'm 46 years old now. I served my country for 20 years. I was betrayed by my family, dragged through a legal nightmare designed to erase my identity, and I survived. I stood my ground when it would have been easier to disappear. I told the truth when lies were more profitable. I chose integrity over revenge, healing over bitterness, beginning again over staying stuck in justified anger. I'm not a hero. I'm not a victim. I'm not the villain they tried to paint me as or the martyr some people wanted me to be. I'm just a woman who fought for her truth and won, not in the way I expected, but in the way that mattered most. I won by refusing to let them rewrite who I was. I won by choosing myself even when everyone else was choosing someone else. And if you're listening to this, if you're fighting your own battles against people who should love you but hurt you instead, if you're struggling to be believed, to be seen, to be acknowledged for who you really are, I want you to know this: your truth matters. Your experience is valid. The people who refuse to see you don't determine your worth. Stand your ground even when you're standing alone. Document everything. Trust your own reality and believe that justice, while slow and imperfect, sometimes does come. You are not what they say about you. You are not the worst thing that ever happened to you. You are not required to shrink yourself to make other people comfortable. You are worthy of starting over, of peace, of joy, of coming home to yourself. And sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart to the possibility that you deserve better than what you've been given. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for bearing witness to the hardest chapters of my life. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Wherever you are, I hope you're finding your own peace. I hope you're learning to stand in your truth. I hope you're beginning to understand that broken doesn't mean defeated, and surviving is its own kind of victory. Take care, and remember you're stronger than you think.